There's nothing but power. That's the only thing that mediates relationships between people, because there's no real world. Everything's a social construct, and it's a landscape of conflict between groups. That's an unbelievably cynical view of human nature. It only really applies to people who are genuinely psychopathic, and they're very rare. The only reason that there are people at the top is because they dominate by power, and I think that's right. I think that's exactly what happens, which is also something that I regard as an absolutely reprehensible doctrine. Can't actually have a reasonable discussion about it. In a functional hierarchy, there's plenty of respect going up, right? Yes. So it's not just power. It's like it's power, it's authority and subordination at the same time, voluntary subordination, because you should be properly subordinate to the people who are better at what you're doing. So you're participating in this process of demonization and polarization. It's so, there's no other way of describing it than stupid. That's what it is. It's an ignorant unidimensional analysis. Get it into your head that you have the capacity for great evil, and stop assuming that that's something that's manifesting itself only in the people that you disagree with politically. Well, that's your job. The world's full of suffering, and you should accept that as your responsibility, past, present, and future. You're supposed to do something about that, as much as you can about it. And maybe you start with your own localized suffering, put yourself together, but then you expand that outward and you decide that you're not a victim of that, even though, you're part and parcel of it, but you're the potential solution to that. And so you accept that as a responsibility. So that's part of taking on a load. That's part of bearing a cross. You could look at it that way. The cross is sort of a symbol of the place of maximal suffering. It's a really good time for everybody to be very careful about what they write and say, and about their motives for tarring and feathering the opposition. That's another thing that we have to be very careful about. I would say that the entire history you look at it this way, is that we oppress ourselves personally with our own malevolence and stupidity. And then we're all oppressed by the kind of the crushing hand of the social world that molds us in one way and not in another. And then, of course, nature is doing her best all the time to give birth to us, but also to kill us and take us out. And so there's this endless, what would you call it, vulnerability that characterizes our existence psychologically and socially and naturally. And the two major problems that people face, obviously, are suffering, tragedy, and malevolence. And so that's the other thing that you're responsible for, is that you're supposed to look at the capacity for human evil as clearly as you possibly can, which is a very terrifying thing. Horrible. It's horrifying. The optimistic part of that is, and this is why it's so useful to peer into the darkness, let's say, the optimistic part of that is that although the suffering is great and the malevolence is deep, your capacity to transcend it is stronger. So what you get out of the most negative viewpoint is the most positive possible consequence. Because one of the things you'd like to know, if you wanted to know something deep about yourself, is that you could face the worst that there was and prevail. Well, back to Marxism. God, maybe I'm starting to run out of patience. That's wrong. I'm doing my best to not take any of this for granted and not get annoyed about it. You're poor, you don't have anything, no one wants to talk to you. You can't get out of it because you're too poor to get out of it. You're penalized by the economic system because you can't even afford to start playing the game. You're stuck at zero. And you can't get out. God, man, some of these people, we've skittered off into these radical oversimplifications. Discussion, it's so absolutely ridiculous. And I would like to point out that I don't actually disagree with anything that you just said. What Dostoevsky said was that, well, human beings are these very peculiar creatures, and if you gave us a utopia so that we had nothing to do but eat cake and busy ourselves with the continuation of the species, that was his line, that the first thing we do is smash it all to bits just so that something unexpected and troublesome would happen, because we're built for adventure and not for peace and happiness. You have to find that thin edge where you're competent at what you're doing, but you're pushing yourself. That's going to be where meaning lies. That's what meaning tells people. It says you're on the edge where you're competent and out of undue danger, but pushing yourself enough so that you're continually developing. That's the instinct of meaning. And that looks to me like it's a consequence of the interaction between the right and the left hemispheres, and a consequence of the interaction between the negative emotion systems, anxiety and pain, that regulate you, that protect you from harm, and the exploratory and play systems that drive you forward. You want the exploratory and play systems to drive you forward, but then they're regulated by these negative emotions so you don't hurt yourself. And if you get that optimally right, then that's the point of maximal challenge. And that makes you really alert because your positive emotion is functioning. That's what's driving you forward. This is worth doing. And your negative emotions are alert too, saying, yeah, but be awake and be careful. Hey, if we can figure out how to make people more effective, well, let's do it. You need that polarity, and people need a load, and we need adversity, and we need difficulty. We need all of that. So maybe what you want is an adventure, the greatest adventure that you could have. And that would involve, something to push against. Okay, point to something. There's the killer combination. Hypercompetence and the capacity for genuine reciprocity. That makes you unstoppable. Something can have evolved as a virtue in some circumstances and still be of the type that, if magnified beyond its proper limits, becomes pathological. You're just the nexus of economic forces, economic and social forces. You're entirely socially constructed. There's no you. Give me some bloody money or something you don't like will happen to you. So easy to be resentful about people who seem to have more than you have, especially if you're not thinking about it very clearly.